I want to welcome you all and say to you that some of the things that we're going to do in the course of this class will include me showing you some videos from events and circumstances of the past related to racism. We will be exploring the history of racism, particularly in this country. We will talk about the science, I should put science in quote, the science of racism, and you may be surprised by that if you don't know anything about it. We're going to obviously look at God's word on the topic, and I have invited some people who may be familiar to you. Some will definitely, others may not be as familiar to you, to comprise a panel who have dealt with racism in various ways in their lives. And they will be answering some questions and talking about what it's like to experience racism. And so I think that there are a lot of things that will be very beneficial and helpful to us in understanding and hopefully equipping us to be good representatives of Jesus Christ as we deal with the issue of racism. I probably should say this to you as well. In the course of us talking about racism and maybe as you look back on your own life and your own life experiences, I would not be surprised if there are occasions when maybe some of the things we talk about elicit maybe some guilt, maybe some shame over ways that you have behaved, ways that things that you have done or thought. And I think that's good, because I'm hoping that if that is the case, that there will be a repentance that can take place so that we can, as God's people, properly represent God's point of view when it comes to racism. I think one of the things that has allowed racism to perpetuate in this country is that churches, God's people, have not handled this in a godly way. And so we will be talking about that as we go through tonight. So let me start off with this quote. The man who made this quote is not black, but he identifies a truth here, I think, as we start. Dan Darling says, racism is sin in two ways. It demeans both the glory of God and the gospel of God. And I think as we go through this class together, you will see the truth of that statement. So just from your experience and perspective, I'm curious. Many of you have grown up in West Texas, but some of you have grown up elsewhere and have had different experiences. I would like to know, what has our country's history been regarding racism? Somebody just jump in. Share what you know. What's been our country's history regarding racism? And if you need to, if you'd like to make a comment, you do need to unmute yourself. And remember, this is a discussion.
Dale?
Yes, sir.
My great-grandfather was an abolitionist, came to Texas from Ohio, and south of Dallas, he had a farm, And if a escaping slave could get to Oklahoma, they could be free. So he provided clothing and food and respite in his barn for escaping slaves and on their way to Oklahoma. And as such, the community was going to hang him because of doing that, but he had neighbors who swore that he wouldn't do it, but he did. And after he was released, the family and 2 or 3 others immediately moved over to Hamilton, Texas, where for some reason, but the community had signs posted on the road that black man, don't you let the sun go down while you're in Hamilton, Texas. And as such, if a black man was making a delivery, say for groceries or plumbing or what have you, he would call that merchant to meet him at the edge of town and escort him for his delivery. And but he didn't spend the night in Hamilton, Texas. And that was the degree of one step above ownership of slaves.
So Duan is sharing the reality that there were very real dangers associated with slavery, with racism, even if you tried to be a godly advocate against slavery, you were putting your life at risk, and that there were cities in Texas openly racist, and even in the messages they left at their city limits. That's not a very good history, and we'll see more of that as we go through this. Someone else, what do you know about the history in our country?
How about separation? Blacks could not go to church with Caucasians. I remember going into Sears Roebuck way back in the last century to get a drink, and the fountain said colored here, white here. And I suspect if you went below in the plumbing, it all came out of the same pipe. But nevertheless, that was displayed. And so in Lubbock, East Side, for example, and it's still there today, a mental separation that the people of color on that side of town and the people who are without color on this side. But thankfully and hopefully Greenlawn is making progress here because of the various colors that are represented here at Greenlawn and wholeheartedly accepted as brothers and sisters in Christ.
Yes, there's segregation. There was separation or segregation of water fountains, bathrooms, schools, and as we're going to find out, if you don't know a whole lot about Lubbock's history, that the segregation or separation that Robbie was talking about was not accidental. It was very well planned, and we will talk about that. Laurie's mother was very involved in, she was affected by, let's say it that way, something of national attention. And so you want to share that?
Yeah, her senior year of high school was 1959 in Little Rock, Arkansas. And at the time it was an all-white school, and they had plans to integrate 8 black students. And there were riots that had broken out. The National Guard was called in. They ended up canceling the whole school year. So because of that, my mom didn't graduate from high school. That was her senior year.
So the implications and the ripple effect of racism is far-reaching, and I think that and I appreciate the comments from Duan and Robbie so far. I think it's very important that we be painfully honest in this class about this subject, because the truth is our country has a very ugly and stained past with racism. And the truth is the church has not been much better. And maybe we haven't been as obvious or as violent, but churches have been as exclusive and segregated. In fact, someone has referred to the 11 o'clock hour on Sundays as the most segregated hour in our country. And so that's not something to be proud of. Any other comments?
Dale,
This is, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We got lots of people wanting to jump in.
this is Peter.
Yeah, Peter.
I grew up in Connecticut, so I've got a much different slant on this than many of y'all. We know that only about a fourth of the geographic part of the country was slave, and when it comes to population, it's even greater than that. And I went to a school where, we never faced those things. I never heard the N-word. We never had fights, but that's because, we had a different kind of segregation. It was that, in the community I lived, you couldn't afford to live in that community unless you were upper middle class. And so I don't know if there's anybody else here, but, I never went to school with children of different skin color or ethnic background at all. And so it's, our congregation in West Hartford, we had white and black congregations that fellowship each other, but the black part of the culture did not want to join the churches. And I know that was true in many places, and it's still true in Michigan in many places. It's not any animosity. I've been in on the discussions all through the years, but people just said, we're just more comfortable being separate. So, I never saw any of the ugliness until it came on television when I was 10, 12 years old. And then, of course, it got worse and worse. But we know that there was by and large, a terrible, vicious prejudice in many parts of the country. But there were 500,000 young boys that died, looking down the barrel of muskets, and the horrible loss of life on both sides. That was caused by some people who had enough guts to say this has to stop. The founding fathers were split down the middle, and they simply agreed to allow slavery not to stop the country from starting. And it's been all uphill since then. But I wouldn't want it to be, to be ignored that there have not been courageous people of all races who tried to, address it and recognize that it was there was a real dichotomy there that didn't mesh. And as time went along, the powers that be, stood for those things. And they didn't do it all purpose. They didn't do it all perfectly, but there certainly was and still is, places where Christians are trying very hard to do what they can.
And thank you, Peter. And for those of you who I'm sure picked up on the fact that he was alluding to 500,000 young men losing their lives during the Civil War that was fought largely, not completely, but largely because of of slavery. Wendy, did you have a comment you wanted to make?
I just wanted to say that I have seen racism, obviously, in my lifetime, and I have seen prejudices and things in relation to color, but I feel very blessed that I went to school where I did, just outside of Lubbock at Roosevelt. We lived in Acuff, and I never remember a time when we didn't have Black and Hispanic children in our school, and we were all friends. There was never any distinction. Now, maybe a distinction about where they lived, or, there were some that maybe were lower socioeconomic or didn't have as much. I mean, my family didn't have much either, but as far as getting along and things, it wasn't that way. And I also was raised at, we were raised at Parkway Drive Church of Christ. And of course, that's in East Lubbock. And they've always called that the colorblind church, because I mean, there were people of all different colors and all different races that went there, and everybody hugs. Everybody is just, you don't look at that. You just don't. And I was taught that, I guess, early on in life, and the fact that our parents worked for the Children's Home of Lubbock and were foster parents for many years. And we just had people of all different races and everything in and out of our home. So it just wasn't something that, I guess my parents did a very good job in teaching us that was not, you didn't look at somebody differently because of the color of their skin.
And you all are moving into the more personal aspect of how you have been affected, and I appreciate you sharing. So that leads us into the next question about how racism has affected you and what is your own history regarding racism. I'm going to just share some things for myself. You all may be able to relate to it and jump in afterward. I have felt removed from racism in my upbringing. I mean, I've seen it, I've heard it, I've even confronted it. But the abolition of slavery was in 1865, and the civil rights movement was in the 1960s when I was just a child. Being white, racism wasn't necessarily a part of my life. I have no obvious prejudice. I believe that all people, regardless of the color of their skin, were free to pursue the American dream. I watched every episode of the epic series Roots in the 1970s and felt sympathy for Kunta Kinte. In short, while I knew racism existed, it did not bother me a lot. That's part of the problem, as we will talk about in this class. As part of my master's and doctorate program in counseling, I took multicultural classes. I realized that many assumptions I operated from were Western values, things like individualism rather than the group, being outspoken rather than soft-spoken, conservative in the expression of emotions unless it was anger rather than more expressive and celebratory, precise time rather than approximate time, etc. And the problem is, if unless you are aware, it can be easy to assume that people who have different cultural traditions are inferior because of those differences. As part of my doctoral work, I did a project with an inner city church that was largely Black. I remember being dropped out. In the predominantly Black community at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, and how quiet it was. I had to awaken the person I was supposed to meet. All of my education and experiences made me think that I was pretty racially astute. And then during the pandemic, when the pandemic started back in March, Laurie and I watched the movie Just Mercy. By the way, that's an assignment for you in this class. I'd like for you to watch that movie if you can get hold of it. And when I watched Just Mercy, that's the first time I think I really got it. It reminded me of the movie or book To Kill a Mockingbird, only this was not fiction. After graduating from Harvard, Brian Stevenson headed to Alabama to defend those wrongly condemned. or those who were sentenced to die in 1987, or excuse me, who were condemned, or those not afforded proper representation. One of those first cases was that of Walter McMillan, who was sentenced to die in 1987 for the murder of an 18-year-old girl, despite evidence proving his innocence. In the years that followed, Stevenson encountered racism and legal and political maneuverings as he tirelessly fought for McMillan's wife. Again, our life. I hope that you will watch that. What have been your own history regarding racism? How has racism affected you?
Hey, Dale.
Yes.
Dennis gave me permission to share one of his stories. When he was in the Navy in the late 70s, early 80s, he endured a tremendous amount of racism because what? Yeah, he was on the ship, you know, the Nimitz ship, and, you know, he was called nigger all the time. I mean, pretty much every day. And even when he would go and talk to superiors, they didn't do anything about it. But also one day, one of the guys, or some of the guys that continuously called him that word, you know, all the time, they pulled him into a room and they hog-tied him, tied him upside down, and he was up there for some time to come, which he's still traumatized by that, you know, now. But, you know, that was really hard, you know, for him, you know, being in the service. And because of that, you know, he has a negative, you know, he thinks negatively of the service because, you know, of how he was treated and some of his other friends were treated when he was in the service. And also he grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, where he experienced some prejudices, you know, as well. And my dad, I grew up in California, so I did not really experience anything personally. I went to Black schools, I went to white schools. You know, I just love, you know, everybody, but, you know, I know what goes on. You know, my dad, he grew up in Macon, Georgia, so he had a totally different experience, and he did not like white people because he said he didn't trust them because of the experiences that, you know, but I didn't allow that, you know, to cloud my judgment because I just like, you know, people, but I understood, you know, where it was coming from. I think this year, for me, probably enlightened me to a whole lot more of the hatred that a lot of people have for people of color. You know, it really kind of opened my eyes as to, you know, how many people really feel, you know, about African American people. And both my sons, they've experienced, you know, some prejudice themselves by being followed by police officers and stuff like that. So just kind of bring it to light.
Thank you for sharing. And tell Dennis I appreciate him sharing that traumatic experience, because I think, again, we need to be aware of the history, and when you're aware of the history, it helps explain some of the things that we see happening among us today. Others,
Dale?
your own personal experience. Yeah, Henry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, my parents, well, I was born here in Lubbock, but in the 60s, we moved to Michigan. So I kind of grew up not really seeing the prejudice until I got a little bit older, when I started dating. That's when I started more seeing, you know, anytime I would date a white female, their dad or their older brothers would, you know, I mean, anytime I went over to the house, there was always comments, there was, you know, smart remarks and stuff. And I, you know, I could blow it off, and, you know, but anytime, you know, when I dated blacks, browns, or Chinese, I never had a hassle from their parents, you know. I mean, and it was kind of ironic because I started really thinking about it. And I had two sons, very young, you know, not married, and she happens to be white. And I didn't marry her because of the fact of her parents. Because I mean, I'll give you a scenario. My son was about 3 years old, and he was in the backyard and at her house, because I was living at my house and she was living with her parents. I was living with my parents, and I would go visit them. Well, my son comes in because he cut his lip because he tripped over a shovel, and all her older brothers were there. She had about 7 brothers, and 4 of them were older than me. And their dad, they were all in the garage. And I remember plain as day, one of the brothers turns around and says, well, if he wasn't half Mexican, he wouldn't have tripped over that shovel. And I looked at him and I said, if you had the brains of putting your shovel away and not leaving it just in the backyard where kids are playing around, my son wouldn't have got hurt. You know, so there was always remarks like that. I got jumped twice by their brothers. And their dad kind of instigated things like that, you know, so it really pushed me away from him. And, but now, honestly, I've got to be honest, my sons being half white and half Mexican, they're not going through this prejudice because they're light complected, you know, and they both got great jobs, and I'm happy, but I don't think they understand both nationalities to a T, you know, how I feel. And but like, again, I'm glad that they're not going through the things that I was going through. You understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is, and why I think sharing stories is that younger generations are experiencing some of the prejudice and racism, as Tammy talked about with her own sons, but probably not to the level that previous generations have. And that's kind of what you're saying here. From your own experience. And what I find interesting is that all of us have stories. And if we had unlimited time, I'm imagining that everybody who's in class tonight could tell a story of how you've been affected by racism and prejudice. But I want to move forward a little bit. Jim Beck, who is an adjunct, I guess he's full-time, he's a missionary in residence professor at Lubbock Christian University, started during the summer what he calls a truth and reconciliation. The first meeting for that was at the Green Lawn building in late summer. It was a chance for white people, largely ministers, at least initially, to do what Jim calls deep listening. And what Jim did, and is still doing, this is something that will go on probably for the next couple of years, is he invited people from the Black people from the Lubbock community to come in and share their stories, and for us just to listen, just to hear those stories. So as you go through this class, I urge you to open your ears and open your heart. Maybe train your heart and your thinking in ways that you don't think were even necessary before the class. Because I'm going to guess that most of us probably have come into this class thinking, I'm not racist, I'm not prejudiced, but I'm going to guess that as we go through this class, you're going to find ways that certain biases and prejudices may surface that you weren't even aware of before we started the class. So I want to ask, just to better define this, what is deep listening? When you hear that phrase, deep listening, what do you think that means?
Focus.
Focus, okay. All right, Laurie says hearing what's going on underneath.
Seeking to understand.
All right, speaking to understand.
Seeking to
Oh,
understand.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Seeking to understand, absolutely.
Grace and mercy.
Grace and mercy, good.
I think deep listening is also letting the person speak, asking questions, going a little bit deeper, and then learning from the person's past history.
Yeah, very good. When you're deep listening, there's an utter respect being displayed. There's no defensiveness when a person says something that may trigger feelings in you. You don't respond with any kind of defensiveness. You're soaking it in. You're hearing with a heart that seeks to think in ways that maybe, again, you didn't think were necessary for you to think that way. You identify with what the speaker's experiences have been. And especially when we have the panel on January the 27th, I encourage all of us to engage in deep listening as we hear what some have experienced and surprisingly have experienced, at least in the deep listening that I have done. I want us to turn to James chapter 2. So everybody get your Bible, whether it's on your phone or you've got a hard copy. James chapter 2. And if somebody would be kind enough to read verses 1 through 13, I would appreciate that.
My brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality. For if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings and fine apparel, and there should also come in a poor man in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes and say to him, "You sit here in a good place," and you say to the poor man, "You stand there," or "Sit here at my footstool," have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brethren, has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? Do they not blaspheme that noble name by which you are called? If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not murder." Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak, and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
Thank you, Brenda. That was I love the way that you read that and emphasized it in appropriate places and ways. So James is talking about a problem here. What's the problem that James is writing about?
Showing favoritism.
Showing favoritism, partiality, some translations say. He's really talking about the sin of prejudice and discrimination or favoritism. What does he call it? He calls it, let me see which verse this is.
Oppression.
Say it again.
You saying oppression?
All right, it is oppression, but I'm looking for
Partiality.
partiality is how some of the translations say it, but he calls it, and I wish I had written this down, but he calls it evil thinking.
Yeah, evil thoughts.
Which verse is that?
Read it. 7, 4.
Okay,
Verse
4. He says, okay, yeah. Verse 4, the end of it, you've become judges with evil thoughts.
Yep.
In other words, what James is saying is you're measuring someone by externals. You're measuring someone by appearances. And when you do that, you are sinning against love. And it doesn't matter what the basis of the externals, what kind of clothing they have on. It doesn't matter if they are disheveled. It doesn't matter what their skin color is. If you judge by externals, if you make some kind of prejudgment, that's sin, he says. So why would someone engage in that kind of favoritism? Why would somebody, especially in a church setting, which is what James is talking about, why would somebody say, hey, here's a perfect seat for you. Come over here and sit right beside me. You know, there's a seat way over there, or if you can't find a place, come here, you sit on the floor. Why would people engage in that type of favoritism?
Self-pride.
Pride? What else?
You think the person that is dressed nicely can give you something where this other man can't?
Okay, so it boils down, Duan mentioned pride, but it also boils down to selfishness. I'm thinking the rich man may be able to do something for me.
Right.
He may be able to help me out in some way. The poor guy, he doesn't have anything that he can offer to me, so I'm going to treat him as a nothing or a nobody. And James says that's not the way Christ people do things. What did James say is God's perspective?
Love your neighbor like yourself.
All right, love your neighbor like yourself. It's interesting that James points out to his readers, he said the poor are often what? The poor are often the ones who are rich in faith. And he says, what about the ones who are rich?
They'll take you to court.
They exploit you. They're the ones who oppress you. They're the ones who take advantage of you. And yet they were the ones who were being given the preferential treatment. So the last question related to this is, how does mercy triumph over judgment? That's verse 13. He says, mercy triumphs over judgment. How does mercy triumph over judgment? That's always been a curious phrase to me. I wasn't sure what it meant for a long time.
There's a corollary to that in addressing a recent widow or widower, and I see a kindness expressed by individuals inviting the widow or widower to just sit by them and be a listener.
Welcoming and helping the person feel accepted, and being a sounding board for that widow or widower. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7 and verse 1 that we will be judged in the same way that we judge others. So what James is saying is, if we will show mercy, if we are merciful, we can expect mercy, and we don't have a reason to fear God's judgment. But the flip side of that is, if we are not merciful, then what? We won't be shown mercy.
Mercy, right?
So he says mercy triumphs judgment. If you want to not experience the judgment of God, you need to learn how to be merciful. And you don't look at people based on their externals and make some kind of prejudgment about them based on those externals. All right? So I think the teaching here that James provides is pretty clear. So let's define some terms in the time that we have left. What is prejudice?
It's a preconceived opinion.
Okay, what's it based on? What's that
Experience.
preconceived opinion based on?
Maybe experience,
All right, do you have
not actual.
do you have an example of that?
Do I have an example? Well, my father-in-law, who was one of the greatest men in my life, he experienced that daily because of the Mexican descent that he came from. And people saw that by the color of his skin and because he spoke a different language, that he was filthy and he wasn't worthy. And I mean, he told us stories that would put hair on your chest.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to learn from that because of who I'm married to, and because my children were called half-breeds. And so it's a prejudice is a preconceived notion.
All right, it's a preconceived notion that, again, is often based on appearances. Before you know someone's heart, before you know someone's character, before you know someone's mind, you have made a conclusion about them. So where do you see prejudice in what James wrote?
Rich man and a poor man.
All right. What was it based on?
The way they look.
Based on, Laurie said, is based on what they wore.
Yeah.
It was, the rich man had very distinct clothing style that, revealed his wealth, and the poor man had a very distinct clothing style that revealed his poverty. And so there were prejudgments made about who and what kind of people they were based on these externals. That's prejudice. What is bias?
Unfair.
All right, there's an unfairness to bias. What more is unfair, is bias?
Well, you can be biased towards your children. I mean, you can favor them. You can favor something.
Okay. Bias is when we favor or disfavor a person, an idea based on our prejudice. Okay. We make a prejudgment and then we show a bias based on our prejudgment. And that bias may be a favorable bias. It may be an unfavorable bias. So where do you see bias in what James wrote?
It results in hiring practices.
Okay, it affects hiring practices, but where do you see it in what James wrote? Where was bias?
The place of honor is given to the rich man.
There you go. The seating arrangements. The wealthy man had the preferable seat. The poor man had the unpreferable seat. One was favored, the other one was disfavored. That's prejudice affecting a bias in how they were related or how they were treated. What is racism?
That's acting on your biases and your prejudices.
All right. What is racism typically based on?
Ethnic groups.
All right. Ethnic groups, color of skin, again, some external quality, and making some negative judgment about a person simply because of that exterior quality. Where do you see racism in what James wrote? Okay, Laurie's over here whispering to me. For those of you who are,
Come on, Lori.
it's not explicitly here in this passage, but racism, as Peter alluded to, is a form of prejudice like we see in James. Okay? Racism is the expression of that prejudice. So I'm going to share with you, and we may come back to this at the beginning of class next week, but this is from a booklet, a study by Eric Gentry from Memphis called Racism and the Cross. And he talks about 4 cars that arrive at a 4-way stop. And I'm going to describe them. And I want you to monitor and examine your own conclusions or prejudices based on these descriptions. Driver number 1 is a white male. He is wearing a sleeveless shirt and driving a pickup truck. There is a gun rack on the back window, and the truck has a rebel flag license plate. Okay? That's what you see. Laurie's whispering again. She said he's from Arkansas. Maybe so.
Pretty much.
All right. My guess is that just in those few words of description, some conclusions were drawn about this first driver. And we'll talk about the good, bad, or the ugly of that later on. But let me read another one. Driver number 2 is a black male. His windows are tinted. Rap music plays loudly, vibrating the car. The rims on the car are large. His driver's seat is leaned back. Okay, as you heard that description, did some conclusions, did some prejudgments start to jump into your mind as you heard that description? Okay, driver number 3 is a white female. She drives a Lexus. She is wearing a polo shirt, tennis racket in the front seat, large ring on her finger. You get some prejudices about that, some prejudgments, some ideas about who she is, what she's about, what her life is like, all those kinds of things that we begin to conclude and assume based on just that kind of sketchy information.
Status.
Okay, you see status in that. That's one of the things that comes to your mind. Driver number 4 is a black male. He drives a Mercedes. He also has a polo shirt on and a nice watch on his wrist. Developing some ideas about who he is and what he's all about based on those few words of description. I think we will come back to this next week and draw this out a little bit more, because I think it's important for us to recognize how naturally we begin to form prejudgments about who people are and what they're about. And while many of us say, well, you know, I'm not prejudiced, it is a natural thing for us as human beings to take our past experiences and interpret present experiences through those past experiences. Again, it is natural to do that. The problem with it is that it often leads to racist ideas. It often leads to biases and mistreatment of people because of that. And those are the things that we have to be conscientious about. But we can't do that unless we're aware of what is actually going on in our hearts and minds as we interpret what's going on around us. Okay? Anyone have any questions or comments as we draw this first class to a close?
Dale, I can think back from childhood that our women wore dresses, hats, and gloves, and a purse. And the men wore suits, ties, and then after worship services, they went outside to smoke. And our culture today includes blue jeans, maybe Bermuda shorts, or very casual dress. And that's more the norm versus what we had some generations ago.
Yeah, and do on what you're saying, again, highlights, if my sense of what is norm is violated, if somebody doesn't dress, in this case, according to what I think is the norm, I begin to form some ideas about who that person is. And most of the time, if they're not conforming to my norm, we draw negative conclusions about them, which may not be fair or right at all. And that's prejudice, which can lead to bias and even racism. So that's the introduction for tonight. I have more material in the introduction, but we'll come back to that next week. Let's close with a prayer. And I encourage you again to continue to examine your own heart as we go through this and root out any racism or prejudice. Become more aware, at least, of what's going on in your own thinking as we go through this class. Let's